Good morning. I'm Rear Admiral Cedric Pringle, the 31st Commandant of the National War College here at Roosevelt Hall. Welcome to Roosevelt Hall. Today you're going to get a tour of this building that was built in 1907 and houses the National War College as of 1946. We are committed to educating future national strategists and getting them to understand all of the elements of national security strategy. Our student body composition is about 59% of uniformed personnel, but we also have about 41% of civilians who represent all of the agencies ranging from Department of State to Department of Energy. So for this year's class, we have 210 students total. 32 of those students are international fellows representing nations from around the world, building the strength of partnerships of the United States with countries around the world, because national security is not just a national responsibility, it's an international one. So we are happy to have you here, and we're happy to take you through a virtual tour of Roosevelt Hall, understanding that we are in a pandemic environment. My personal preference would be to have you here personally so that you could see the rich history that this building holds. And on behalf of the National War College Alumni Association, which we've partnered with, as well as National Defense University, as well as the Theodore Roosevelt Association, we are honored to have you tour our building.
I remember my first day as a new faculty member driving on post and looking up and seeing this building and feeling, getting the actual physical sensation of what I think President Roosevelt intended this building to be, which is a building of mighty shoulders. And it was marking that time in our history where we were really assuming world leadership. And so as I approached this building on my very first day as a faculty member, I remember kind of putting this on, that we had this great sense of responsibility for what we were doing here. So let me give you a little bit of the history of the college, what we do, and why I think this institution is really a treasure for our country. During World War II, three men reflected seriously on what would be the needs of our country as the war concluded. General Eisenhower, Hap Arnold, and General Marshall, as early as 1943, were already making the assumption that we would not be fighting wars in the way we had, certainly during World War II, two armies fighting each other over land. And as they reflected on this, they thought, we need a new way of approaching the training for our military officers before they take positions of leadership. When the war ended, General Eisenhower had this idea in mind. And when he came back from war, he came to this building, which had been the Army War College. And as he contemplated the challenges ahead, he decided to take this building and make a new institution, the National War College. And his concept, his vision from the beginning, was that it should include all four services, so not just the Army, but it would be the newly formed Air Force, which was also happening at this time, the Navy, the Army, and bring the four services together with our diplomats, with the State Department, and then with the newly developed intelligence community. So his idea, his vision from the beginning, is that it is in that combination of all of the communities that are involved in national security. They should come together for a year of essentially graduate study. At that point in their life, when they're maybe around 40 years old, these officers would be, let's say, mid-career. They would be selected by their services and by their agencies for future leadership challenges and responsibilities. And so this college was set up by General Eisenhower and other leaders of World War II, anticipating change. Take a moment and imagine the Depression, the Great Depression, was still a vivid memory for everyone. How the country, the economy suffered through the Depression, hunger, poverty. So that was in everyone's minds. How can we avoid doing that again, going through that? What made that happen? That was still being studied. And then obviously the horrors of World War II. Not just the horrors of what we saw in Europe in the fight with Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, but obviously the horrors in Asia as well. And so when people came home, there was a natural inclination to say, war is over, as Averell Harriman said, all people really want to do is go home, get married, and have a Coke. So there was a normal desire there to just come back to a peacetime enjoyment. But yet, as I mentioned before, General Eisenhower really had a vision that history would not stop. As we were readjusting to the new threat of this change that we were seeing, the Soviet Union had been an ally in World War II. And now Stalin was taking certain activities, making certain advances, negative actions, that were drawing attention to the fact that his ambitions were different than peace. And so at that point, there was a request for analysis of what was going on with the Soviet Union, what was happening here. And kind of a lesser-known State Department officer who had been posted in Moscow and in Europe during World War II wrote what's now called the Long Telegram, which was an in-depth analysis of Stalin himself, Russian history, the geostrategic issues as the Soviet Union saw its role in the world. And as that telegram kind of circulated here in Washington, there began to become a new vision for how do we look at this next strategic threat to the United States. And it was in that mix of activities that Eisenhower said, we need to form a new school to study this. And so he took this building, as I mentioned before, which is a massive, beautiful building. In that period of 46, 47, not only did he established the National War College, but we also passed as a Congress the National Security Act of 47, which established the CIA, the Air Force, the NSC, and basically the architecture of government that we needed. We were anticipating this threat, that we needed to see our way forth in terms of meeting the threat of the Soviet Union. And a key aspect of this actually happened here in this building. A wonderful quote from Admiral Hill, who was our first commandant, and this room I'm in right now is named for him. He tells a wonderful story that, and again, put yourself in his shoes. He was on the Naval Task Force out in the Pacific, getting ready to support the armed army invasion of Japan. And he got orders that he would probably come here after World War II. At the conclusion of the war. And at the time, he was preparing for invasion, a brutal, horrible invasion that he knew was lying ahead for him in his career as an admiral. And it was right around this time, obviously, that the atomic weapons were used and the war came to an end. And he reflects on this period, and he was talking to some of his colleagues, and he said, how should I take on this new assignment as the first commandant of the National War College? And what he writes in his memoirs is that the conclusion was, and a colleague said this to him, make the students ponder, make them ponder. He came here and he addressed the first class of the National War College in Arnold Auditorium, which you'll see on this tour. And he stood there before a class of around 100 people. And again, it was kind of like Noah's Ark. There were some Army, some Navy, some Air Force, some State Department, some intelligence community, a mixture of all of these students. Some had been general officers, actually, in World War II. Most of the officers had come from combat. And he looks at them and he said, we're here to give you dilemmas over and over again. You will go on now to higher levels of responsibility. You need, at this stage of your career, to understand economics, because we knew that the threat in the Soviet Union was a threat of communism and Marxism. A military officer might have spent his career flying jets or on a submarine, and yet at that point of their lives, it would be the time to look at economics, geostrategic issues, geography, the breadth of issues that form the context for strategy. And as I mentioned before, one of the fortunate coincidences that happened for us is that the man that wrote the Long Telegram, the man that had the in-depth analysis of the Soviet Union, again, knew Stalin personally, was George Kennan. And when he came here, he also got, as his next assignment, coming from Europe after World War II, where he was a prisoner of war briefly, he got the assignment to be our first deputy commandant. So George Kennan was offered this opportunity to be the first deputy commandant at the National War College. And what he brought to this was invaluable because of his knowledge of the Soviet Union. He was able, because of his understanding of the weaknesses within the bureaucratic structure of the Soviet Union, the historical predispositions of Soviet leadership, and especially the unique psychology of Stalin. He was able to put forth, along with other people he was dealing with in Washington at the time, a strategy. And the strategy was known as containment. And basically his assumption is that there are certain inherent weaknesses within the Soviet system that if addressed with patience, and he talked about patience, and I have to add to this that he also was very much impacted, as all Americans, all the world was, by the destruction of atomic weapons. So the concern after the end of World War II is that the new technology of destruction in terms of atomic and the nuclear weapons was of such gravity that we had to really rethink the nature of competition in the world and war. And so Kennan's strategy, taking that into account, said, if we're patient, and if we can contain the ambitions of the Soviet Union, if we can contain their expansionist drive, that pressure of containment would eventually force them to implode because of the rigidities, the inherent problems between a centrally structured economy and, again, the unique issues within the Soviet political structure. Now, as we look back at that era, and we look ahead and we say, well, this strategy worked. And indeed, certainly there were wars, there was the Vietnam War, there were other wars. But in terms of did the world explode, destroy itself in a nuclear exchange? No. By the end of the Soviet Union, by the end of that entity, we had achieved our goals without the type of destruction that we were so fearful of. So when Kennan came in 46, 47, he wrote wonderful memoirs and a wonderful book, which is called Measures Short of War. And it's really a compilation of his lectures here at the War College. And the theme of these lectures, again, giving the students an in-depth understanding of what this enemy was about, who the characters were, their history, the culture, and his advocation to them to think about strategy. How can you achieve your ends without the use of force? Yes, you prepared for the use of force, and certainly we're a war college. But I always thought when I came here that what I was studying, and General Powell says it himself, I studied here in order to achieve peace. So from those early days, Kennan was a guiding force in our academic preparation for the students. He was an intellectual force at this college, and even after the time he went back to the State Department, he would come here every year to lecture. He continued to lecture here when I started teaching here in 1993. As I recall, he gave a lecture every single year until he was 96 years old. And I think I have a picture of him in that year of his life, totally coherent, totally just a masterful, masterful strategist. So his involvement, along with the idea that we are a joint college, we have all the services, we're an interagency college, we bring together all the agencies and departments that have something to do, commerce even, we bring everybody together. And again, going back to Eisenhower's vision, he knew, he had great instinct about decision making. He knew that in all of our students' future, they would be dealing with each other. Eisenhower knew that effective decision making was enhanced if the characters involved in the decision already knew each other, already knew each other's qualities. And I can give you an example of this. My husband was U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. That is always a difficult and challenging assignment. At the time we were there, the commander of the Central Command, the chief military officer for the Central Command, was General Mattis, Jim Mattis. Jim Mattis was a student of mine, but he also knew my husband when they were here at the War College. And so this year at the War College, intentionally, in terms of Eisenhower's vision, constantly circulates to students. So in each seminar and each class, you are constantly working with a new group to do what Admiral Hill said. We're presenting the students with dilemmas so they ponder the course of action ahead. And they will have known each other well enough. They all will have worked on a dilemma together with each and every other person in this class until the year is over. So the War College itself, to me, when I first came here in '93, as a new faculty, and I have to say one aspect of the genius of Eisenhower, let's say, is that he knew that the faculty should be diverse itself, not just the student body. I had a 17-year career on Capitol Hill. I worked on bipartisan issues. At that time in our history, we were a much more bipartisan nation, and so we worked together on issues. And I had done everything on Capitol Hill from agriculture policy through defense appropriations. So when I came, I was representing that aspect of the national security decision-making process. We had economists from the World Bank. We had obviously other military officers that came here for a year or two on the faculty. We had people from the executive branch who came here for a year or two on our faculty. We have always had that mix. For the years I taught here, I went from just being a faculty member to the first woman actually, to be a department chair of a graduate school for military education. And again, every year I taught here, it was a privilege. I learned from the students as much as whatever they might have learned from me. So I want to reflect just for a few more minutes about strategy, what it is that we teach. We do have other war colleges, and at the time, honestly, when Eisenhower set this school up, he felt that maybe the other war colleges wouldn't be necessary. And then he evolved his thinking to say, well, maybe we should have an Army War College, an Air Force War College, a Naval War College, but that this would be like a graduate above, one more level up. And you need all those things. You need an operational focus, and certainly the services war colleges do that. But again, the focus for our college is strategy. And so what we've taught from the very beginning is how do you look at all the tools of statecraft, all the instruments that a president in a country can have at its availability, and how do you marshal those together to affect the needs of our national interest. On one road leading up to the War College, we have the beautiful historic buildings for the general officers who live on this base. And Admiral Hill had one of these houses. So when he was commandant, he lived essentially right down the street. In that first era, and again, I hope we can find a way back to this era, people from Capitol Hill, members of Congress and the Senate, would come over occasionally, hear a lecture, and then go to Admiral Hill's house for lunch. There were no press. They had an informal discussion with the speaker to ask questions. Again, at that era, what was Stalin up to? That was what was on their minds. Is Stalin our friend or is Stalin our enemy? What type of challenge does Marxism hold for us? They were able, at these luncheon events, to take the time in a bipartisan way to learn together with our speaker. And again, as another sign of this, we have a wonderful picture of President Truman, who also was drawn to this college and as a newly named, or as he assumed office after President Roosevelt died, we have a wonderful picture of President Truman coming basically by himself with maybe one or two Secret Service agents, walking up these beautiful steps and coming into Arnold Auditorium and listening with our students to understand in a deeper, richer way what was happening in the world, especially in terms of the Soviet Union. I always felt that the reason why containment was such a successful strategy, if you think about it, we adhered to this strategy for 40 years. We funded it, we supported it in a bipartisan way for 40 years. And I always felt the success was based on those lunches, those private times for reflection and learning that happened together. Now, jumping ahead in terms of the other strategic eras we've been in, I happened to be teaching here on the day of 9/11. I was in one of our seminar rooms. Interestingly, no one interrupted us. It was a beautiful morning, as everybody who was alive at that point remembers that day in Washington. It was a blue sky, a beautiful day. We were talking, it was the beginning of the academic year, and we were talking in my class about the foundations of strategy. And as class ended, I heard somebody screaming that the World Trade Center buildings a plane had flown into them. And I was department chair then, and we had this long debate about should we evacuate the building. We knew there was a plane loose. It was the plane that eventually crashed in Pennsylvania, but at the time we didn't know if that plane was coming to the White House, where the War College. We didn't know what was happening. We decided to stay here in place for a while. Everybody went home that night. And we had an expert on our faculty who really knew the issue of terrorism. And his name was Bart O'Neill, and I asked him, I called him that night, and I said, the early reports here are saying that this was Al-Qaeda. Could you give a lecture tomorrow? And he said, of course. And for many of our students who were focused on other aspects of national security, that was the first time they had ever heard the group Al-Qaeda. Bart gave a beautiful, wonderful, powerful lecture for about 2 hours. I knew at that moment we would have to change our curricula, which we did on a dime, and refocused our attention to this particular type of threat. And I remember thinking, in fact, the room I'm in right now, many of our nation's leaders came to this room to try to think through various wargaming scenarios of how we would be responding in those early days after 9/11. And I remember reflecting myself that we did not have a George Kennan at that point. We really didn't know that much about Osama bin Laden. We didn't have a man who had known Osama bin Laden for many, many years as George Kennan had known Stalin. And so in those years I taught after 9/11, I realized that we had a comparison. We were still struggling in that period of trying to readjust to what that threat was. This was, at the time we used the phrase, a non-state actor, an asymmetric threat. This was not the nation of Saudi Arabia invading the United States. This was a group. The members of this group, some came from Germany, some came from Saudi Arabia, some came from Jordan, and yet would we declare war against Saudi Arabia or Germany? So our students, again, in the line of our tradition, we confronted them with many dilemmas. How does a nation state respond to the threat of a non-nation state attack? So for many years, again, we had the wonderful access in Washington to bring together. I had Islamic scholars come. We had religious scholars come to help us think through the nature of a threat that made references to divine interpretations of holy books. This is not something the normal Marine or Air Force fighter pilot grows up thinking about, and yet we knew in this course we had to expose our students to what was the motivation of the enemy. And so for a long period of time, that was our focus. And now as I reflect on the era we're in now, with cyber threats, data mining, the invasiveness of the social media world in our lives, a pandemic, the array of threats that certainly I could not have imagined in 1993 when I first started teaching here. Yet, in some respects, our role here at the War College is just as important, if not more important, because we now are presenting the students of this year's class who are studying remotely because of the pandemic. We're still presenting them with dilemmas. How do you balance the interests of the United States? How do you adjust to changing environmental, global power, technology changes? And how do you prepare these students, again, from all four services, from the State Department, from the Commerce Department, the FBI, the intelligence community, knowing they still will be working together to enhance the United States' interests and the cause of peace? How do you help them anticipate the problems that seem so important right now, but again can also change on a dime, so that when our students, who are now around 40 years old, when they assume their leadership positions, let's say when they're 50 or 60 years old, what will those challenges be? We've always said here at the War College that we don't teach you what to think. We teach you how to think. And that's why I loved teaching here and why it was an honor for me to do it. I think the notion of pondering is something we certainly could use on Capitol Hill and in all aspects of government. It is hard to know where you are in history. It's hard to know if you're seeing the beginning of a trend or the end of a trend. In fact, one of the things I feel that we do the best job of here is that when a politician, it could be the president or a senator, anyone, says to a military officer, do something. There's a threat, do something. What I hope we still do, I know we still do, we help that officer say, let's take it back a step, and what are the implications of each decision path you might take? So we're not telling a elected official what to do. We are also trying to say, how do you think through this issue? Here are the alternatives, here are the options, the courses of actions you could take. Each one has a benefit and a cost, and how do we think these things through together? So yes, I think we are still teaching not only our students to ponder, but help elected officials ponder with us.
The first time I walked into the building, I think it's the same experience as anybody else has had. I think you'd be very hard to find somebody who hasn't been genuinely awed by the building and just the visual effect of it. It's not just the scale, but it's just the visual effect. It's a building that's hard to replicate. The building was dedicated by President Roosevelt personally using Masonic rites in February of 1903, and the laying of the cornerstone was central to that ceremony. It's still a piece of the building today. We have a generally good idea of where it is to this day in the northeast corner of the building. Every February, the cornerstone is recognized by the Theodore Roosevelt Association and the National War College Alumni Association. But over the course of 4 years, the building was constructed at a cost of about $700,000 using granite and limestone mainly, but also with a lot of iron accenting throughout as well. The building reflects Theodore Roosevelt very, very much, and also reflects the times that the building was built. It was a time of great American expansion and the United States becoming more of a player on the world stage. And you see that reflected in the architecture around the building. It's a building that uses Greek and Roman architecture all throughout, with elaborate designs and various features ranging from the columns to the archways, the domes, and cornices and things of that nature. The building's domes, arches, the cornices, the pillars, and the like, all very much reflect a very neoclassical style. And in fact, the domes are very, very unique in the sense that they use a style called Gustavino style. Okay, the Gustavino tile style is actually what the dome work is made up of around the university. And it's an interesting tile scheme where that it just simply uses the tiles. There's no steel or concrete support. for these domes. And so that makes it very unique. Again, as you see, it makes a very marvelous overall look to not only the rotunda and the entrance areas, but also to the two extensions, the east and the west extensions of the actual building. In the rotunda area, we have a plaque permanently dedicated to the memory of Major General Leslie J. McNair, who was killed in action during World War II. He was actually the most senior ranking member of the armed services, killed by friendly fire, in fact. And he remains interred in Normandy to this day. But the post was named after him, and during World War II, while classes at the then Army War College in this building were suspended, he commanded from this building as well. And so he's a very central figure to our history and to our culture. And in 1946 is when we first started with the National War College concept and classes in session. The Army War College that was here in 1950 moved to the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. President Ford in 1976 dedicated the National Defense University, which essentially pooled the two major schools that we still have today, the National War College and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, which is now known as the Eisenhower School, together into one university. And it is the university concept that we have today. And he performed that dedication ceremony inside the rotunda area. In the rotunda, we'll find a few major items that are of significant interest. I would start out first of all with the most noticeable item of all, which is the apex at the very top of the dome. It measures about 80 feet from the ground, and the chandelier that hangs from it is about 3,000 pounds. Affixed to the rotunda, we do have as well the dedicatory plaque of the 1903 Roosevelt dedication here. And you'll notice that on that plaque, aside from the dates and also the names of Elihu Root, who was Secretary of the War at that time, we have the firm that was responsible for the architecture, McKim, Mead, and White, listed there. And they were a very significant architectural firm. So in the rotunda, special collections, which is a part of the library, in the archives, we maintain a number of displays on various themes that the school studies or themes that are related to the actual school's history or the history of notable leaders of the school or class graduates. So our displays have ranged from Civil War. They may also involve World War II and the D-Day invasion, among other topics as well. And so we rotate those exhibits periodically, not only to preserve the materials, but also to bring in new themes as well from time to time. Part of the exhibits that we have in the rotunda that we are rotating also focus on none other than President Theodore Roosevelt as well, given just so much material about Roosevelt. He was larger than life and certainly such a central figure to the establishment of what we now have today, the National War College. So we never have a shortage of Theodore Roosevelt, whether it be any type of memorabilia, physical memorabilia or portraits or the like. We really focus a lot on that at the NDU Library and Archives, and distribute that willingly to the National War College exhibits. Also in the rotunda area, we have the plaque to McNair. But we also have some artwork there as well. Artwork of Secretary Elihu Root, who was really one of the front thinkers about establishing an Army General Staff, which was not done at that time. Part of that thinking was because of lessons learned from the Spanish-American War, specifically lessons learned from command mistakes that were made from that. And Elihu Root, again, as Secretary of War, was a real driving force in establishing what we now have, the Army War College that later became the National War College. He, along with Theodore Roosevelt, were very instrumental in that. In the rotunda, in fact, we also have busts of some of our prominent graduates and also figures who the students study, such as Clausewitz. Theodore Roosevelt has a bust, appropriately enough, since it is Roosevelt Hall, and it is a building that we really can credit to his fortitude and vision. Also, General Powell, as a graduate, has a bust in the rotunda. He graduated from the National War College in 1976, actually the first year of NDU's inception, as we know it today. The room where I'm sitting at this moment is the Powell Wing. It used to be known as the West Wing of the War College, but in 2015, really what it comes down to is that the NDU Library, the NDU Archives, where I work, we had so many Powell gifts and artifacts that we just needed some place to put some of that material. And so we set it up here with the War College to dedicate the West Wing to one of the most distinguished graduates that we've got, and a real champion for the National War College, I might add, General Colin Powell. So we now call this the Powell Wing. We have a number of not only objects in here of his, but also a number of photographs and documents that are on display. Yeah, some of the items would include not only his actual family photographs, photographs of him throughout his career, also his yearbook as well from the National War College, the class portrait from 1976 as well. Yeah, the Powell quote behind me is etched here permanently to commemorate the Powell Wing and his legacy, and it does give a lot of credit to, again, the mission of the school, which is that we want to promote peace, and that's a mission that it goes back a long ways. It goes back really to the original mission of the National War College and its concept, that we promote peace through the strategic thinking and through strength, military strength. So for him to give such credit in his career, development to his experience here, really is remarkable. The previous purpose of the Powell Wing originally was the War College Library, and it's a library collection that was actually one of the oldest military collections, believe it or not, that we do have on record in the United States. And at that time, we had about four or so actual stories of shelves, cast iron shelves. In fact, we've kept some of that shelving here for Powell's artifacts and other books from his collection for that matter. But we'd have about 4 stories of that shelving along with catwalks and the like. So it was quite an interesting appearance and design setup. In fact, what I can see in my vision here are actual dumbwaiters, wooden dumbwaiters where you could put the books in and actually lift them up. to be shelved in the stacks overhead. The portrait of Theodore Roosevelt, which is now located in the Powell Wing, has a significant provenance to it. It was actually commissioned and presented by President Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt, and at that dedication was none other than Dwight Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was there, and the portrait was to commemorate 50 years since Theodore Roosevelt took the presidency. So again, a very significant dedication. Again, very appropriate for Roosevelt Hall, and a building that President Roosevelt was very much hands-on responsible for. The Napoleon bust is, it's a miracle that we have it, let's put it that way, because they were constructed by Antonio Canova in Italy and presented, or at least attempted to be presented, to the city of Marseille, France, not long after Waterloo. That presents kind of a problem because by then Napoleon's popularity was not very high. So the busts were actually threatened to be destroyed, but we had an American consul to France at that time who rescued 5 of these busts. And one of them was unfortunately lost at sea, but through his family lineage, the War College was able to obtain one, and the other 3 are either at museums or owned by private owners. In 2 locations, the Rotunda and in what is now known as the Powell Wing, we have flags on display. Starting with the Rotunda, the flags are from the different military branches and also the State Department as well. Again, to signify the joint concept of the National War College as it stands today. In the Powell Wing, the flags that are on display are international in nature, and they're meant to recognize the international students who are a part of the program every year and to pay respects to them. Part of the concept of the National War College was the interagency inclusion, namely the State Department inclusion. So we have a permanent ambassador who is staffed here at all times throughout the years of the War College, and that corridor therefore is afforded to that ambassador and is basically named the State Department corridor. And it's an interesting corridor because not only is the ambassador's office there, but we also have an exhibit dedicated to really our first ambassador, George Kennan, who was here in the 1940s at a very pivotal time in this nation's strategic history, a changing time. And it was during that time, actually, that he was here at the National War College that he wrote what is known as the Mr. X article for Foreign Affairs magazine that really outlined much of what we would consider the containment strategy the United States employed for the next 40 or so years. So in some of our corridors here on the second floor of the National War College, we have student plaques from every year. And what's notable about that also is that these plaques starting around 1989 also include the international students as well, because it was at that time that we had an emerging International Fellows Program. And you can see that these international student plaques tend to grow as the years go on. And so these are students who are actually learning alongside American students. And I think it's certainly a real testament to, again, the peace building that we try to do here at NDU and through the War College, and also diplomatic efforts. The other corridors at the War College do have designations. Well, first of all, the Joint Corridor, which is very appropriate, seeing that we are a joint school along with NDU being a joint university that brings all the branches together of the military. But each corridor, the other corridors have specific branches as their emphasis. So we do have an Army, Air Force, and Navy corridor as well in different locations throughout the building. In the military corridors, we do have a number of artifacts, photographs, images that are specific to the branches. And also in the Joint Corridor, we have all the chairman's official portraits as well. And those portraits are all inscribed, dedicated personally to the National War College, which makes them very unique. One of the notable statues, well, really the only statue that we've ever had, for that matter, here at the National War College, was that of Frederick the Great. And it's a funny story because Frederick the Great was presented, and really nobody knew what to do with this statue, but it ended up here at the site of what would be the Army War College, or eventually Roosevelt Hall. So we have construction photographs where the building is not even built, but Frederick the Great, the statue is actually erected out front where we now have the Esplanade. And the concept was, along with Frederick the Great, to have other world military historical leaders such as Caesar and Napoleon and the like. So Frederick the Great was the only statue that we did end up having, but it was after the building had been constructed during World War I. It was being somewhat vandalized and harassed, and so was put away in storage and then later moved for its own security to the Carlisle Barracks, where it now still resides today, even though there are a few of us around, historical minds around, that would love to bring Frederick the Great, the statue, back to Fort McNair. Arnold Auditorium, structurally, it is considered an asp in that it is circular and it kind of extends outward from the building. It's actually part of the building's original architecture plan. The architecture plan is known as Beaux Arts, and again, a very functional design where you see it here in the War College with the rotunda and the grand entrance leading immediately to the Arnold Auditorium, and then two wings extending. And the Arnold Auditorium is essentially where the students gather to hear distinguished lectures, especially from visiting distinguished lectures. And then from there, those students can question those lecturers, and then afterwards break out into their committees to as we've heard, ponder and work on dilemmas. The Arnold Auditorium, it's named after General Hap Henry Arnold, one of our handful of five-star generals or admirals in the United States history. And we give him that auditorium dedicated to him because he, during the time of World War II, was one of the initial driving forces for educating officers on other branches of the military. And in that auditorium, we also have a few items of his, not only his portrait, but also his five-star Red Army flag. There's also a blue five-star Air Force flag, but at the time the Air Force was the Army Air Force, so he got an Army flag as well. And then also a letter to him from the Wright brothers, I believe in 1909, that we have on display as well. Hap Arnold had written and asked how certain components of the experiment had been going. And it was clear, though, that there was a good conversation there, that he could converse with the Wright brothers and had a real expertise in flight. Yes, the Roosevelt Conference Room it's a room that we have specifically dedicated to him. It does have a number of art, pieces of art in there, photographs and the like, that again give credit where credit's due as far as the building goes to Roosevelt. It's a great place for meetings and for discussions and learning as well. COVID students will have their committee rooms where they can work on, again, discussing the dilemmas and the problems that are put forth to them regarding national security. And those rooms are located throughout the building in different corridors. And then typically after receiving lectures, for example, in Arnold Auditorium, the students will break out into their committees, to those committee rooms. But of course, with COVID, that long tradition of how students learn and interact has been greatly disrupted, although the virtual is at least seems to be working very well. The Hill Conference Room is a stunning room. It's gorgeous, has a wonderful view. It's actually named after Admiral Hill, who was the first commandant of the new National War College. And he was a very, very pivotal figure in the Pacific Theater during World War II. But the Hill Conference Room has had some significant national strategic meetings in there over the years. A lot of planning has taken place in that room. Also, Project Solarium as well as a notable event. This was an event, a tabletop exercise, if you will, started by then President Eisenhower to try to bring all the nation's prominent national strategic leaders together onto basically the same page of thinking on how to deal with the Soviet threat. So the room has been used for very important purposes through the years, and on top of that is just aesthetically a masterpiece. Artifacts in the Hill Conference Room include mainly items from Hill's career, including artifacts from the USS Harry Hill as well. And that would be a naval destroyer that was named after him, and I believe it was decommissioned in the 1990s. But we do have a number of photographs there through the years of the room in usage for various meetings and also its administrative duties. As throughout the National War College building, you will see student gifts that are here, and also the student class plaques as well. And the student class plaques are very interesting to browse because they do have names of very prominent individuals who have graduated here, who have gone on to do remarkable things. People like Colin Powell or Secretary Mattis, who again really stand out. And oftentimes, when taking international groups around, the international students will also see names in the student plaques for the international fellows that they recognize. So it's a real source of pride and excitement for them. Student gifts. Each year the student body will come together to think of a good gift for leaving behind. And the one that stands out to me the most, one that I was directly involved with, in fact, was in 2006, and that was for the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the National War College. And it's a beautiful glass, colored glass, almost like a gong type of structure that is located on the top story of the building. Very well constructed and beautiful. So it's a way of students to leave their names, their legacies here. It really shows that they become a permanent part of the university. Students often do come back to the National War College for alumni events. I think the Alumni Association is a very strong one for the National War College, and there is a definite sense of pride and belonging. Each year, the National War College hosts the birthday celebrations for the different branches of the armed services in the rotunda area, and they'll bring in the brass bands or what have you, do a cake cutting ceremony oftentimes on the ground floor, and with the acoustics of the rotunda, the grandiosity of the dome work and the like, the music just really amplifies. It makes it a very special experience. So we do that, and then also on top of that, there are certainly dinners and the like that are held in the rotunda area for special events. That again, it just makes it for a very magical experience in a building that everybody loves to be in. My favorite part of a tour is, I think, exiting the building. As strange as that may sound, but the reason why is because the building has just a magnificent view of Washington, D.C., a panoramic view, if you will, from the portico, from the front entrance. You can see all the way from the National Cathedral to the Capitol.
Well, once again, I would just like to thank you on behalf of the National War College as well as the National Defense University. Thank you for visiting our historic building. We also want to thank you on behalf of the Theodore Roosevelt Association as well as the National War College Alumni Association. One thing I did not mention is that the graduates of the National War College typically go on to do some really impressive things. Our graduates range from folks as distinguished as former Secretary Colin Powell, former Secretary James Mattis, as well as former Senator and now deceased Senator John McCain. And to me, these are always a high watermark of our students, and any opportunity that I get to talk to the current National War College class, I get an opportunity to set the bar high, just as President Theodore Roosevelt would have wanted us to do. So thank you, and please come back and see us when the situation permits. Thank you.